So have you ever found yourself kind of staring at a financial decision? Maybe feeling a bit lost or overwhelmed?
Yeah, definitely. Or maybe you see someone else.
Exactly. Like someone you know is super smart.
Right.
But they do things with money that just seem, well, reckless.
Or the opposite, someone totally unassuming who ends up being, incredibly wealthy, and you just wonder, why? How does that even happen?
Yeah. How do people behave the way they do with money? Well, welcome everyone to The Deep Dive. This is where we sift through some amazing sources to pull out the really key insights, the stuff that helps you get genuinely informed.
And today, we're diving into that very question. It's this fascinating intersection of, human behavior and finance.
We're drawing heavily from Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money, which honestly is brilliant, surprisingly simple in some ways, and really profound.
Absolutely.
Our mission today really is to get under the skin of why we act the way we do with our money. Forget complex formulas for a bit.
Right. This isn't about spreadsheets, not really.
No, it's about human nature, our emotions, our personal histories, even how new some of this financial stuff actually is. It all shapes things so deeply.
We'll be looking mostly at the intro and first chapter of Housel's book today, and it's packed with these incredible anecdotes, research.
Yeah.
It really makes you think.
It really does. I found the core idea almost deceptively simple, but the impact is huge. Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. And Housel kicks things off with a story that just perfectly nails his main point right from the start.
He does, doesn't he? It immediately challenges what we usually think leads to financial success.
Yeah, because he basically says, look, doing well with money has maybe a little to do with how smart you are.
Just a little.
Yeah, maybe just a little. But it has a lot to do with how you behave, your actions, your, emotional control.
So it's less about having a PhD in finance and more about not freaking out.
Kind of. It's about discipline, self-awareness, managing those impulses. Housel argues that stuff can be way more critical than, say, formal training or knowing complex theories, which, when you think about it, that really shifts the focus, doesn't it?
It totally does, from external smarts to internal, stability.
Exactly. It's internal.
And that first story you mentioned, the one he opens with, it drives that home immediately. It's this tech executive in L.A.
Right. The genius guy.
Total genius. On paper, the kind of person you'd assume has it all figured out financially. Designed a key Wi-Fi component in his 20s, patented it.
Wow.
Launched multiple successful companies, sold them, made a ton of money. I mean, business-wise, wildly successful.
So you'd expect him to be pretty savvy with his own cash, too.
You would. But his actual relationship with money, Housel calls it a mix of insecurity and childish stupidity, which is pretty harsh, but...
Okay. How so?
Well, the stories are kind of nuts. He apparently carried this huge wad of $100 bills, inches thick.
Seriously.
And he'd show it off.
Yeah.
To anyone, whether they asked or not. He'd just whip it out and brag loudly about his wealth, often when he was drunk. It's like he needed everyone to constantly know how rich he was.
Sounds like some deep-seated insecurity driving that, maybe. Needing that external validation.
That's what it sounds like, but it gets even weirder.
Oh, boy.
One time, he gives a hotel valet thousands of dollars in cash. Tells him, go buy gold coins.
Gold coins. Okay.
An hour later, the valet comes back with the coins. The exec gathers his friends on a dock over the Pacific Ocean. And then they start throwing the gold coins into the sea. Yes. Skipping them like rocks, laughing, arguing about whose coin went furthest, just for fun. Thousands of dollars worth of gold.
Unbelievable. Just throwing money away, literally.
And then a few days later, different incident. He breaks a lamp in the hotel restaurant.
Yeah.
The manager tells him it's a $500 lamp. He needs to pay for it.
Okay, fair enough.
So the exec pulls out his brick of cash, again, the huge wad of hundreds, and peels off $5,000. Hands it to the manager.
10 times the amount.
Yeah, and says, now get out of my face.
Wow.
And don't ever insult me like that again.
Wow. Okay, so the ego, the irrationality, it's off the charts. How could someone that smart with business be so destructive with his own money?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, maybe inevitably, is that years later, Housel finds out the guy went broke.
Broke? After all that success?
Completely bankrupt. Mind-boggling. It clearly wasn't about a lack of intelligence. He had tons of that. It had to be something else.
And that's exactly Housel's point, right? That quote, again, Doing well with money has a little to do with how smart you are and a lot to do with how you behave.
Bingo.
That tech guy, for all his brains, let his emotions, his ego just totally derail him financially.
Yeah. It wasn't about the spreadsheets for him. It was about showing off ego impulse.
Right. And Housel immediately contrasts this with another story, showing the power of simple, boring behavior.
Ah, yes, the story of Ronald Reed,
Yeah.
which is just, it's amazing. Housel says it's his favorite Wikipedia entry. American philanthropist, investor, janitor, and gas station attendant.
Janitor and gas station attendant turned philanthropist. Okay, tell me more.
Ronald Reed, born in rural Vermont.
Yep.
Super humble background. First in his family to finish high school. Apparently hitchhiked to campus every single day.
Wow, dedication.
Totally. And his life was, pretty ordinary. Fixed cars at a gas station for 25 years. Then swept floors at JCPenney for another 17.
Okay. Long, steady work history.
Had a small house for $12,000 when he was 38. Lived there his whole life. His wife died when he was 50. He never remarried. His main hobby, chopping firewood.
Just a quiet, simple life. Doesn't sound like someone heading for millionaire status.
Not at all. But then he dies in 2014, age 92, and suddenly this quiet janitor is making international news.
Why? What happened?
Because his net worth was revealed. Think about this. In 2014, almost 3 million Americans died. Fewer than 4,000 of them had a net worth over $8 million.
Okay.
Ronald Reed was one of them.
The janitor. $8 million. Half.
Exactly. Everyone was stunned. In his will, he left $2 million to his stepkids and over $6 million to the local hospital and library.
That's incredible. So where'd it come from? Lottery. Inheritance.
That's what everyone thought. But nope. Housel makes it clear. No secret, no lottery win, and no inheritance.
So, how then?
It was simple. Almost boringly simple. He just saved what little he could consistently. Put it into blue chip stocks and, big stable companies.
Okay. Sensible investing.
And then this is the key part, the really hard part. He just waited.
Patience.
Decades of patience. He let compound interest do its magic. Those tiny savings over decades grew into more than $8 million.
Wow. Patience and consistency. That's it.
That's it. Now, contrast that with the other guy making headlines around the same time, Richard Fuscone.
Okay, Fuscone. Let me guess. Different story.
Oh, completely different. Polar opposite. Fuscone was everything Reed wasn't. Harvard educated, MBA from Wharton, top executive at Merrill Lynch.
Right, the epitome of financial elite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So successful, he retired in his 40s to focus on philanthropy. Got praised by the CEO of Merrill Lynch for his business-savvy leadership skills, sound judgment. He was even on Crane's 40 under 40 list. The guy screams success.
Okay, so the absolute contrast to the janitor, we've got Mr. Humble Patience versus Mr. Harvard High Flyer.
You got it. But Fuscone's story doesn't end well either. Remember the tech exec?
Yeah.
Similar pattern here.
Uh-oh.
Mid-2000s, right in the middle of that massive housing bubble, Fuscone borrows huge amounts of money, like huge,
To invest, right?
to expand his house in Greenwich, Connecticut. And we're not talking about adding a deck. This place was 18,000 square feet.
18,000. Good grief.
11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 pools, 7 garages, a palace. And the cost to just maintain it, over $90,000 a month.
90,000 a month just for upkeep. That's
And
staggering.
it's insane. The debt must have been astronomical. It screams lifestyle inflation, just completely out of control. Trying to keep up appearances, maybe.
Or just pure excess, a total lack of grounding, perhaps, driven by greed, ambition.
Probably all of the above. And then, of course, 2008 happened.
The financial crisis.
Yep. It hit Fuscone like a wrecking ball, crushing debt, assets he couldn't sell easily. Bankruptcy.
So the High Flyer crashed.
Crashed hard. He apparently told the bankruptcy judge, "I currently have no income." Imagine saying that after being a top exec. His place in Palm Beach. Foreclosed. The massive Greenwich mansion. Sold in a foreclosure auction in 2014 for way, way less than it was supposedly worth. A total wipeout.
Wow. So Ronald Reed, the patient janitor, ends up with $8 million. Richard Fuscone, the Harvard finance star, ends up bankrupt.
It's stark, isn't it? The contrast couldn't be clearer.
And Housel just lays it out, doesn't he? He says, basically, Ronald Reed was patient, Richard Fuscone was greedy.
That's it. Full stop.
And that behavioral difference, patience versus greed, it completely eclipsed the massive education and experience gap between the two.
Behavior trumped brains. Behavior trumped pedigree.
Massively. And it makes you think, like Housel points out, where else does this happen?
Right. Can you imagine a janitor doing better heart surgery than a top surgeon?
Impossible.
Or designing a safer skyscraper than a world-class architect?
Never. Those fields rely on deep technical knowledge and measurable skill. Mistakes are catastrophic.
But in investing, apparently the janitor can outperform the Harvard MBA. It happens.
So why? Why is finance so different?
That's the core question Housel tackles. He argues it's because finance isn't really a hard science. It's not physics.
Not governed by strict, predictable laws.
Exactly. It's much more of a soft skill.
Yeah.
It's deeply psychological, how you behave under pressure, with temptation over long periods. That often matters more than knowing the equations.
The psychology of money. It's right there in the title.
Yep. And this is where the traditional way we learn about finance kind of falls short, isn't it?
How so?
Well, finance is usually taught like it is physics or math. Formulas, data, calculations.
Discounted cash flows, standard deviations, efficient frontiers, all that stuff.
Right. How much to save for emergencies 6 months. Save 10% of your income. Calculate the cost of capital. It's all presented as very precise, very numerical.
And that knowledge isn't useless, obviously.
No, not useless. But Housel's point is crucial. Knowing what to do tells you nothing about what happens in your head when you try to do it.
The gap between theory and practice, between knowing the path and actually walking it.
Precisely. You can know you shouldn't panic sell in a downturn, but actually not panic selling when your life savings are evaporating. That's a whole different ballgame. That's psychology.
It reminds me of, say, dieting. Everyone knows what to do, basically eat less, move more. But doing it consistently, that's where the struggle lies. Emotions, habits, stress.
Great analogy. And Housel makes a comparison to healthcare. Look at medicine, amazing progress, right? Life expectancy up, diseases cured. Science consistently replaces old ideas with better ones. We're objectively healthier because of it.
Yeah, undeniable progress driven by scientific rigor.
But finance. We've thrown brilliant minds at it. Ivy League grads, complex models, financial engineering. Billions spent on research.
Okay.
But Housel asks, is there any real evidence we're actually better investors collectively? Are we less prone to debt bubbles, better savers, more realistic about money and happiness?
And his answer is?
He says he sees no compelling evidence. We still make the same kinds of mistakes, maybe even bigger ones now with more complex tools.
So the core problem is thinking about money too much, like physics rules and laws, and not enough like psychology, emotions, nuances, biases.
That's the argument. Physics is predictable. People, not so much.
Right. Housel mentions how the 2008 crisis really drove this home for him. To understand why people took on insane levels of debt, you didn't just need to know about interest rates. You needed to study human greed, insecurity, optimism.
Or why people sell everything at the absolute bottom of a crash. It's
Yeah.
not about calculating expected future returns.
No, it's about the gut-wrenching fear of looking at your family and thinking you've ruined their future. It's raw emotion.
Pure primal fear. It overrides logic, which connects to that Voltaire quote Housel uses.
History never repeats itself. Man always does.
Yeah. Our behaviors, our psychological patterns with money, they seem to persist across time, regardless of the specific circumstances.
Which leads perfectly into Housel's first big principle in the book, this idea he calls no one's crazy.
I love this concept. It starts with this observation that's just, wow. He says, your personal experiences with money make up maybe 0.000000001% of what's happened in the world.
A tiny, tiny sliver of all financial history.
But maybe 80% of how you think the world works.
80%. So our own limited experience massively outweighs everything else we might learn or read about.
Exactly. And that huge gap is why, according to Housel, no one's crazy when it comes to money decisions.
What looks crazy to me might make perfect sense to you based on your life.
Precisely. Think about all the ways our experiences differ. Different generations, different parents, different incomes, different values.
Growing up in different countries, different economic climates, different job markets, different levels of luck, good or bad.
All of it. We all learn fundamentally very different lessons about how money works, what's important, what's risky, what's possible.
And what you live through, what you experience firsthand. That's just way more persuasive, way more visceral than anything you read in a book or hear from an expert.
Totally. It anchors your beliefs. So you can have two equally smart people looking at the exact same economic data.
And they come to completely opposite conclusions about what to do.
Right. And both conclusions feel totally logical to them, based on their own ingrained worldview, shaped by their unique past.
It explains so much conflict and misunderstanding around money topics.
It really does. Think about specific examples. Someone who grew up poor versus someone born into wealth. Their ideas about risk, saving, spending, fundamentally different.
Or someone who lived through hyperinflation versus someone who's only known stable prices. Their fear or lack of fear
Yeah.
about inflation will be worlds apart.
The Great Depression generation versus the dot-com boom generation. Totally different views on the stock market's potential and pitfalls.
Even geographically. Australians haven't had a recession in like 30 years. Americans have seen several big ones. That shapes your baseline assumptions about economic stability.
Absolutely. Housel tells that great story about JFK.
Oh, yeah, the Great Depression story.
Right. A reporter asks him what he remembers about the Depression. And Kennedy, whose family was incredibly wealthy, basically says, I have no firsthand knowledge.
He said his family had more money then, bigger houses, more servants.
Yeah. He said he only really learned about the Depression by reading about it later at Harvard. He experienced it as something happening out there, not something impacting him.
Which became a real issue in his presidential campaign, right? People wondered if he could truly understand the struggles of ordinary Americans.
Exactly. And it highlights that key point. Reading about something, studying it, even trying to be open-minded, it just cannot recreate the raw feeling of living through it, especially the fear and uncertainty.
You can't truly simulate the panic of watching your savings disappear or the dread of potentially losing your home. Spreadsheets don't capture that gut feeling.
No way. That feeling of looking at your kids and wondering if you've made a terrible mistake, that's not on any financial model.
It reminds me of that quote from Michael Batnick. Housel includes, some lessons have to be experienced before they can be understood.
So true. You can warn someone about touching a hot stove, but they don't really get it until they feel the burn.
And this isn't just like pop psychology. There's actual academic research backing this up, right?
Yes. Housel cites a really important study by economists Malmendier and Nagel from 2006. They looked at decades of data from the Survey of Consumer Finances.
Which tracks how real people manage their money over time.
Exactly. And you might expect, logically, that people make investment choices based on their current goals and today's market conditions.
Makes sense. Rational decision-making.
But that's not what they found. They found people's lifetime investment decisions are heavily anchored to the economic experiences they had, especially in their early adult lives, those formative years.
So what you lived through when you were, say, 18 to 25 has a massive impact on how you invest at 40 or 50.
Huge impact.
Right.
For instance, people who grew up when inflation was high, they consistently invested less in bonds later in life. They learned viscerally that inflation eats away bond returns.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. You avoid what burned you before.
And people who grew up when the stock market was booming, they put more money into stocks throughout their lives. They learned to associate stocks with growth.
So their willingness to take risks isn't necessarily based on objective analysis, but on their personal history.
That's the core finding.
Yeah.
Malmendier and Nagel concluded that risk tolerance depends heavily on personal history, not intelligence, not education, but the dumb luck of when and where you were born.
Wow. Dumb luck. That really frames it differently.
It does. And Housel gives more examples, like Bill Gross, the bond king.
Right, the legendary bond fund manager.
He himself admitted his incredible success was largely because his career perfectly overlapped with a massive, decades-long decline in interest rates. That made bonds amazing investments for him.
But for his father's generation, who saw rates rising, bonds might have seemed like terrible investments.
Exactly. Same asset, totally different experience based purely on timing, on when you happen to be investing.
Or think about the stock market for different generations. Housel compares someone born in 1970 to someone born in 1950.
Yeah, the difference is stunning. If you were born in 1970, the S&P 500 basically went up tenfold, adjusted for inflation, during your teens and 20s.
Incredible growth during those impressionable years. You'd probably think stocks are amazing.
Totally. But if you were born in 1950, the market went essentially nowhere, inflation adjusted, during your teens and 20s.
So you might come away thinking stocks are risky and don't really pay off. Completely different mindset, just based on birth year.
Same with inflation. Born in the 1960s in the U.S., you saw prices triple in your youth. Gas lines, shrinking paychecks. Inflation was real and painful.
You'd likely be very inflation conscious your whole life.
But born in 1990,
Yeah.
you've barely experienced any significant inflation. It's probably not even on your radar as a major risk.
It's like living in different financial universes.
It is. Think about unemployment, too. Housel gives that stark example from November 2009, deep in the recession.
What were the numbers?
National average unemployment was bad, around 10%. But for young African-American men without a high school diploma, it was nearly 50%.
50%. Unimaginable.
While for, say, college-educated Caucasian women over 45, It was only 4%.
The lived economic reality for those groups was just worlds apart. The fear, the opportunity, the outlook, completely different.
Or World War II, German and Japanese markets totally destroyed, people starving. Meanwhile, the U.S. market doubled, strongest economy ever. How can people from those different experiences possibly think about risk or security in the same way?
You can't expect them to. They learn different lessons because they live through different realities. They're crazy, makes sense in their context.
So, back to no one's crazy. Their financial worldview was forged by their fire, not yours.
Which means we shouldn't expect everyone to react to the same information the same way or trust the same advice.
Or even agree on what's fundamentally important when it comes to money. Our experiences create these deep, often invisible divides.
Yeah. And Housel uses that Foxconn story to illustrate this point about different realities really powerfully.
Oh, that one's tough, but important. He talks about the New York Times piece on the terrible working conditions at Foxconn, the electronics manufacturer.
Right, making iPhones and stuff. And Western readers were understandably horrified. Exploitation, bad conditions.
Our immediate reaction, based on our standards, our context, is outrage.
Definitely.
But then Housel shares this comment left online by someone whose aunt worked there, a Chinese worker.
And what did the nephew say?
He said, basically, that before Foxconn, his aunt was a prostitute, and that the exploitation in the factory, however bad it seemed to us, was actually a huge improvement for her compared to being exploited on the streets.
Wow. That's a difficult perspective to process.
It really is. The nephew argued that Americans often don't grasp the lack of options elsewhere. Factory work is hard, yes, but maybe it's the best available choice compared to even worse alternatives.
It throws that black and white judgment into question, doesn't it? What seems unequivocally bad from one angle might be seen as a step up from another, much bleaker reality.
My gut reaction is still discomfort, wanting to argue for better standards everywhere. But it forces you to acknowledge how different lived experiences create entirely different frameworks for what's acceptable or even desirable.
And if that applies to something like working conditions, think how much it applies to financial choices. Housel's point is that every decision someone makes with money,
no matter how nuts it seems to us.
Right. It makes sense to them in that specific moment based on their unique view of the world. They might be wrong, objectively. They might miscalculate, be misinformed.
Or just be really bad at math.
Yeah, or swayed by marketing. But the decision itself stems from a narrative in their head that feels logical and justified based on their past experiences and current situation.
You see this logic, maybe controversially, with lottery tickets.
Ah, yes, the lottery paradox.
Americans spend an insane amount on lottery tickets, more than movies, games, music, sports, books combined.
It's huge. And who buys the most?
Mostly lower-income households. They spend about $400 a year, on average, 4 times what higher-income folks spend.
And the paradox is
that a huge chunk of those same people couldn't come up with $400 for an emergency.
So they're spending their potential safety net on a 1 in a million shot. Mathematically, it seems crazy.
It does seem crazy from a rational financial planning view.
Yeah.
But Housel pushes us to imagine the why from their perspective.
Try to get inside their heads.
Yeah. He paints this picture. Maybe they feel stuck paycheck to paycheck. Saving feels impossible. Getting a much better job feels impossible. They see others enjoying stuff, vacations, nice cars, secure housing, college for kids without debt, things that feel totally out of reach for them.
Okay. So a feeling of hopelessness or lack of other options?
Maybe. And Housel imagines they're thinking, buying a lottery ticket is the only time we get to hold a tangible dream of getting that good stuff you already take for granted. We're paying for the dream.
Paying for hope, essentially.
And maybe you don't get it because you're already living the dream. Wow, that hits hard.
It does. It doesn't make buying lottery tickets a good financial decision, objectively.
No, definitely not.
But suddenly, you can kind of understand the motivation behind it. You see the internal logic, even if the external outcome is poor.
That phrase Housel uses, what you're doing seems crazy, but I kind of understand why you're doing it. That captures so much about financial behavior, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Decisions aren't made in a vacuum with a spreadsheet. They're made at the kitchen table, in meetings, where personal history, ego, pride, marketing, fear, hope, it all gets jumbled together into a story that makes sense to us at that moment.
And then there's this other huge factor Housel brings in, which makes understanding our financial behavior even more complex. He calls it the newbie factor.
Newbie, as in we're all new to this.
Pretty much. His point is, while money itself is Ancient coins existed back in 600 BC.
King Aliotes, right, in Lydia.
That's the one. But our modern ideas about managing money, things like saving for retirement, investing long-term, they're incredibly young in the grand scheme of human history, practically infants.
That's a fascinating point. We treat these concepts like they're timeless wisdom, but maybe they're just recent inventions we're still figuring out.
Exactly. Take a retirement. Today, there's something like $27 trillion sitting in U.S. retirement accounts. Saving for retirement drives so many decisions.
It's a huge part of modern financial life.
But the whole idea that everyone is entitled to or should plan for a long retirement, that's super new. Maybe only 2 generations old, tops.
What did people do before?
Mostly, they worked until they died. Seriously. Until the 1940s, over half of American men over 65 were still in the workforce. Retirement wasn't really a distinct phase of life for most people.
So the idea of decades of leisure funded by savings is historically unusual.
Very unusual. Social Security started in the 1930s, but the early payouts were tiny. That first check Ida Mae Fuller got in 1940, about $400 in today's money per month.
Not exactly living large.
Not at all. Average Social Security checks didn't even cross $1,000 a month inflation adjusted until the 1980s. And poverty rates among seniors were sky high until the late 60s.
What about pensions? Didn't everyone used to have a good company pension?
That's mostly a myth, actually. Even in 1975, only about a quarter of seniors had any pension income. And it's usually a pretty small part of their overall income.
So the dream of the gold watch retirement wasn't the norm.
Not for most. The whole idea that individuals should save and invest diligently for their own dignified retirement, using things like 401ks and IRAs, that really only took root in the 1980s.
The 80s? That's really recent.
Think about it. The 401k itself wasn't even invented until 1978.
Wow. Less than 50 years ago.
And the Roth IRA, 1998. It's barely old enough to order a beer.
Okay, seeing the timelines like that, it changes things. These tools we rely on are just experiments, relatively speaking.
So Housel concludes, it really should surprise no one that many of us are bad at saving and investing for retirement.
We're not crazy.
We're all just newbies. We haven't had centuries to develop the instincts, the cultural norms, the multi-generational wisdom around this stuff. We're learning as we go.
That makes so much sense. And it's not just retirement, is it?
No, same logic applies elsewhere. Look at college. The number of Americans getting degrees exploded after WWII. Went from like 5% in 1940 to 25% by 2015.
Huge societal shift. More opportunity, presumably.
Yes, but at the same time, college tuition costs went up 4-fold after inflation. So you have this massive increase in people going to college, combined with soaring costs, and almost zero historical experience as a society in managing large-scale student debt.
Which helps explain why student loan debt became such a crisis. People were navigating a totally new landscape without a map.
We were all just winging it, making decisions about huge sums of money with very little precedent to guide us.
And consumer debt, generally mortgages, credit cards, car loans, that widespread use, also really only took off after World War II.
Right. So much of what we consider normal financial life today is incredibly recent in human history.
Housel's dog analogy really lands here.
Oh yeah, the dogs. Tell that one.
He says dogs were domesticated maybe 10,000 years ago, but they still bark at the mailman, they still chase squirrels. They retain these ancient, wild instincts.
Oh, yeah.
And here we are, humans, with maybe 20 to 50 years of experience in this complex, modern financial system.
Expecting ourselves to be perfectly rational and adapted.
Exactly. It's an unrealistic expectation. Our financial instincts, our behaviors are still catching up to these very new financial tools and systems. We're bound to make mistakes. We're still learning.
That puts everything into such perspective. So, wrapping up this whole no one's crazy idea, our money decisions aren't just about logic. They're soaked in emotion, shaped by our unique and often very recent personal histories and the societal systems we find ourselves in.
Which explains why we don't always do the rational thing, and why judging others' financial choices is often missing the point entirely. Their crazy has its own internal logic rooted in their experience.
It calls for a lot more empathy, doesn't it? Both for ourselves and for others.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've really journeyed through some deep psychological territory today. We saw that finance is way more about behavior than just being smart, highlighted by those incredible stories of Ronald Read and Richard Fuscone.
Yeah, patience versus greed trumping education and experience. A powerful lesson.
We explored how our personal experiences, the dumb luck of when and where we were born, overwhelmingly shape our financial worldview, making crazy decisions perfectly logical from an individual's perspective.
The no one's crazy principle, understanding that different lives lead to different lessons about money.
And we just touched on how incredibly new many modern financial challenges are. Retirement, college debt, meaning we're all essentially newbies navigating these systems, often without a reliable historical map.
Right, we're still adapting to these relatively recent financial inventions.
So understanding all this psychology, this history, how does that help you, the listener?
Well, hopefully it brings more self-awareness to your own decisions. You can start recognizing the lens you view money through your own unique biases and experiences.
You maybe foster a little less judgment towards others, realizing their choices make sense within their story, even if it looks odd from the outside.
It promotes humility, really, and
Yeah.
empathy.
And that enduring lesson seems to be that true financial success often boils down less to genius and more to cultivating those simple, powerful behaviors: patience, discipline, managing emotions.
And understanding the powerful psychological currents that affect us all.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you to chew on after this deep dive. Housel stresses that no amount of studying or open-mindedness can genuinely recreate the power of fear and uncertainty from lived experience.
Right. Reading about a crash isn't the same as living through one.
So if that's true, and knowing that our own perspective is limited by the dumb luck of our own time and place, what can we proactively do now? How can we build financial resilience knowing our own experience might have blind spots we can't even see yet?
That's a good question. How do we prepare for the unknowns shaped by experiences we haven't had?
Something to think about. Maybe take a moment to reflect on your own money psychology. What past events, big or small, might still be influencing how you think and act with money today?
We hope this exploration into the psychology of money has given you some valuable insights and maybe a new perspective.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Deep Dive.